people do consider me as being a photographer. But the truth is, I don't consider myself to be one. You see, to be a photographer, there is only one thing you need. It's money to buy a camera. And what I see nowadays is that there are lots of people with really nice cameras in hand, and they just go around and they shoot, filling in their ego. And I'm really not like that. I don't shoot randomly. When I shoot, I have the image on my head and I try to make the best of it. I try to put what's on my head on an image. That's why, if you ever ask me if I'm a photographer, I will always say no. No, I'm not. At Trops, I am a photographist, which is very, very different than being a photographer. I take special care on the graphism of my images. If the object is in this place, it's because I wanted it to be there, not by random choice. You see, everything is exactly as I wanted it to be. There are no randomness on my images. And then, if you add a sense of history that I have, and you try to put history and photography together, you'll get me. So I would faster shoot a homeless den with its narrative than a guy with a Ferrari or a top model with an f1.4 lens. This being said, let me take you back around 200 years ago. These two, Peter and Michael, were the direct descendants of King John VI that had recently died. Peter was the oldest, so therefore naturally the heir to the crown. However, Peter was also Emperor of Brazil. Michael, being the youngest, had no expectancy to become a king, but his claims were that if Peter was already Emperor of Brazil, he could not be a Portuguese king. Therefore, Michael would be the king. This, of course, gives birth to the Portuguese Liberal Civil War, where in one side you had the liberals being headed by Peter, and on the other side the absolutists being headed by Miguel. Sadly, all this happened when photography was taking its initial steps, so there are no images around. There are, however, first-person reports of what happened. And using this book, I'd like to guide you through the life of a liberal soldier, especially on what concerns the Battle of Alcacer do Sal, called the Battle of Barrosinha, and the Massacre of Algalé.
After 3 or 4 days, the order came for us to march to Belém, and we went to quarters at the Convento dos Jerónimos, a barracks where I did not stay, so that at 11 o'clock at night, I marched with a detachment of 2 captains to the Torre de Belém, where the brave Baron of Pico de Celeiro was governor. We did campaign service there, and a few days later, the detachment was ordered to march to Setúbal, which we did, embarking at the Navy Arsenal at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and disembarking at Moita, where we arrived at midnight. From Setúbal, we set sail for Alcacer and disembarked at Faias. The enemy withdrew as we approached, and we entered Alcacer, a town where everyone was constitutional and who welcomed us with openness and joy. The bells rang, and the town, despite the heavy rain that was falling, was lit up. Lieutenant Marques and I stayed at the house of a man called Silva, who welcomed us, both he and his good family, in a way that still inspires gratitude, not only for his generous openness, but also for another reason of greater importance, which was that they took an interest in me when I was later taken prisoner. It is quite clear that the elements of which the force was composed were as heterogeneous as possible, which is always detrimental to the good result of an action. Furthermore, the state of its ammunition was very poor. From what I observed in relation to the strength of my battalion, the force numbered 1,500 soldiers, composed of contingents taken from the 7 fixed corps in Lisbon, which were so called because they were made up of older and less seasoned men, 2 companies of English soldiers, the Alentejo Battalion, a Frenchman company, sailors and soldiers from the old Marine Brigade, horses from the 11th Cavalry, and a force from the 4th Mobile, of which I was a member.
Look at them.
Come on, to the water. Before the enemies arrive.
This was, if I remember correctly now, more or less the state of the force and its organization when it marched to meet the enemy. It was about 2 o'clock when the enemy passed in front of me and posted their artillery on a small path a little to the left, and with the second shot, the bullet killed, if I remember correctly, the officer of the Naval Brigade. This officer was coming to speak to me when he was hit by the bullet that killed him. As we can imagine, the 8 shots corresponding to the 8 cartridges we had were fired. In the meantime, I was wounded in the left leg by a piece of shrapnel. Fortunately, my sergeant, whose name was Paulo Jorge, was a brave and spirited man, and so he continued to fire with that piece as best he could.
So this is the remnants of a Roman villa. Apparently there is a very nice mosaic below this, which they covered, and they did very well in covering it. I know what that is. That is definitely Roman. That's roof tiles, Roman roof tiles.
And as ironic as it might seem, the gun emplacement that our narrator is talking about was directly set on top of these Roman ruins, which in the end is a complete irony to all this campaign.
Look at the work. And this is called Porto de Rei, because if you look over there, so you have the waterway and then you have the river, and the river is absolutely full of mud. That's just mud, and it's not knee-deep mud, it's man-deep mud, believe me. So the cannon that they were using would be somewhere in this vicinity.
Having regained some control of myself, I returned to my post and saw that there was no more ammunition to continue using the gun. It was useless to remain there. Consequently, I ordered the gun to be jammed with the remaining bullet and withdrew towards the pine forest, where I expected to find the force. Unfortunately, it had already withdrawn.
So after ditching and jamming the cannon, they went all the way through here. They most likely passed through that abandoned house over there. And then the next town just ahead is Barrosinha. And then in Barrosinha they were caught between what we call the sword and the wall. They were really in a bad position to be. They were forced to the river. Most of the soldiers, they tried to swim to the other side, but they died in the mud. They died drowned in the mud.
I then followed my men along the road, which is flanked on the right by the river, and at that time on the left by a ditch. On the road, I met 2 companies of Englishmen, who were commanded by 2 officers, who, I believe, were called Bailey and another Fitzpatrick. I joined them with the soldiers who accompanied me, and with this united force, we resisted a force of enemy cavalry that pursued us until the village square.
And here I'm going to do a little pause on the narrative. This because the place itself where they were shooting with the cannons that now holds a ruin of a Roman house, it's actually not very photogenic and it doesn't relate to the facts happening there. So I noticed that there was an abandoned castle close by with just one watchtower, and this is something that the narrator, although he did not describe it in his book, actually saw it in place as well. So that's the photo that I'm going to get.
I'm going to shoot that medieval tower over there, but I don't like the light from here. It's a bit too harsh, even it's now 7 p.m. I'm going to the other side and try to photograph it against the light. Let's see how it goes. Still a bit far away though.
But eventually I was able to find my composition in a very quiet, shadowy place where I was just interrupted by a local farmer who thought I was actually hunting, go figure, and he stopped by and asked what I was doing because he was actually the owner of that land. So I had to give him, a little bit of satisfaction and explain what I was doing there.
Diga, venha aí dia pra gente falar, a gente
And with the camera in place and the image already drawn, it was time now to start shooting. And I quite like the image. I like the subtle swirly curvature of the lower part, but I also like the top of the image. It's actually quite nice and quite moody. I did manage to do a second image, which also turned out to be quite alright. Not as moody as the previous one, but quite acceptable at least. So going back to our narrative, we have our courageous officer who just arrived at Barrosinha to find that everything is in a really bad shape and all is lost.
Everyone scattered, and I went down an alley, and when I got there, I saw a lot of people in disarray trying to cross the river, which was almost impossible because the tide was low and the boats were dry. Unfortunately, those who tried to cross drowned in the mud. From the state in which I saw things, I recognized that we were lost. I asked the people who were there to, out of charity, take me in to see if I could escape being taken prisoner. Unfortunately, those people repelled me, and shortly afterwards, 2 guerrillas and a cavalry soldier, on foot, took me prisoner, who, without mistreating me, took me to a high place, where the commander of the enemy force, the famous General Lemos, was.
And with all the twists and turns that history does give us, this is also another big irony. You see, in front of me there's this huge in a way, stadium, which is now completely abandoned, where in the past this was the battlefield where General Lemos was.
And this is the abandoned football field of Barrosinha.
And although almost 200 years passed by, it's very hard to imagine that in this such quiet and peaceful place, something really atrocious happened.
When I arrived there, I saw the 2 English officers already taken prisoner, many soldiers from my battalion and from other corps, many English, who in all were 432. After some time, they took me and the 2 English officers to General Lemos, who was some distance away on horseback. He asked the English if they wanted to remain in the service of Mr. D.Miguel, to which the proud officers replied, "Never." Then Mr. Lemos called me over and asked me, "Do you want to remain in the service?" I replied that I did not. To this, the general replied, smiling, "Take that belt and that sword away from him. He will follow the fate of his comrades." After that, an officer came up to me and gave me a tremendous slap, saying, "You big scoundrel who was caught red-handed."
So our narrator was captured by the enemy, and on the first day of captivity, he spent it in Alcacer do Sal, in the town's barn. The following day, the group of more than 400 soldiers was actually divided in 2. The soldiers who were told to do a really long march till Beja, and the 28 officers who were informed that they would be spared the long march by going through a detour. Little did they know of what was going to happen. The person in charge of taking our officers to Beja was the magistrate of the same town, Beja, and our narrator goes to him and asks, "I know that you're going to spend the night with Mr. Silva at his house. Can you please ask him if he can send me some food? Because when we arrived at Alcacer before the battle, that was the house that I was in." Now, do you remember that he was wounded on one leg and that the Sergeant Paulo Jorge, which actually owns my name, I'm actually called Paulo Jorge, took control of the situation and did as best as he could? Well, the sergeant asked him if he could become an officer as well, because the treatment given to the soldier and to the officer was completely different. So, our narrator turns Paulo Jorge into an officer, and he gets included in this group of officers that is marching. Now, on the very first day of March, they are told to stop at the town called Vila Verde, where they slept outside in the rain and in the cold. On this first night, and this was unknown to everybody, one of the prisoners disappears. However, the The magistrate of Beja turns to our narrator and says this.
When Mr. Nerona came to me, told me to get up, took me a short distance away and said the following, which I repeat verbatim. I have already found out who your honor is. I therefore have every interest in saving you. When we get to Porto de Rei, stand behind me. And now goodbye, we are going to march.
Now, don't think for once that the magistrate Noronha is going to do this out of his own goodwill. He is intended to save the narrator, but the narrator has to deliver a letter and also has to talk to the emperor on his behalf. More on this later on.
And so it was. He moved on and we set off. On the way, I was considering what Mr. Nerona had told me and talking to the gorilla. Suddenly he said to me, "The magistrate seems to me to be your friend," which surprises me because he has no constitutional friends. Hearing this, I was as if struck by lightning. And I, who was thinking whether or not to stand behind, as he had told me, decided not to. We arrived at Porto de Rei and were put in a house with very thick walls and windows overlooking the river. I hid in one of the windows, and from there I saw the magistrate settling the prisoners, and at the same time it seemed like he was looking for someone, as in fact, he was looking for me. When he saw me, he said to me, somewhat annoyed, "Didn't I tell you to stay behind me?" The magistrate came to the window where I was standing and observed the height, and then, turning to me, he asked me, "Do you have the courage to jump down from here?" I said yes. "Very well, when the lights go out, jump down from here." At that moment the lights went out. Immediately I hung from the window and let myself slide down the wall, falling onto the sand. Mr. Nerona was already there, who took me to a house where he hid me behind a curtain and where I found Mr. Silvers from Alcacer. The two of us remained, Mr. Silva and I.
And it is then now that the magistrate of Beja asks our narrator to deliver a letter to his family and also to talk to the emperor, saying that what he's about to do, he was ordered to do so. That is actually a liberal who was forced to sign to fight for the absolutist side. This to say that what he is about to do, it's obeying orders and actually against his own will. And our narrator says to him, "But your honor, I do not know the place. I am bound to be found again and recaptured." So he orders a slave mulatto to go with them with specific instructions to deliver them to Setúbal, which is a nearby town.
The three of us, that is, Mr. Silva, the mulatto and I, left a quarter of an hour after the prisoners had left for Algalé. We climbed a small slope, moving as far away from the road as possible. After an hour and a half of our journey, in which we could make little progress because of my wound, we felt a volley, and after this volley, loose shots, which had the effect of being fired by a line of shooters in extended order. Since we could not judge the reason for the fire, we made several hypotheses, each of which was the most frightening in relation to our distressing and dangerous circumstances, which led our guide to move as far away from the beaten path as he could, forcing us to walk through the bushes, quite frightened and fearful. Little did we think that those shots were fired at our comrades, who were thus cruelly murdered, shots that, if we had been closer, we would have heard mixed with the painful groans of the victims, who were, as I later learned, shot without being blindfolded, throwing themselves at the group of 26 until they were destroyed. This kind of death certainly did not happen to any other tyrants. Unfortunately, 25 officers and Sergeant Paulo Jorge were shot in Algalé.
Do you see the irony? This is a sergeant that asked our narrator to become an officer to be better treated as prisoner, and he got killed.
Their names are engraved on a tombstone that was erected in that place, a tombstone that has a double meaning. It is a symbol of honor and remembrance, dedicated to those honorable and courageous martyrs of freedom, and a stigma of perpetual execration for those who ordered their assassination. 2 names are missing from that tombstone, which is why there were 28 of us. One is mine, the other never found out what happened to him.
And this is actually not very accurate, because further on his memoirs, he writes that he passed by, the group of 3 persons passed by the very same place where they slept the day before, in Valverde. And there they found a body which had been stabbed to death. Now, according to other reports, this is the magistrate of Leiria, who was a very big critic of the magistrate of Beja. So he found himself being captive, and the magistrate of Beja, when he realized what he had in hands, he isolated the magistrate of Leiria and he stabbed them to death on the very first night. So many thanks for watching this video till the end. I hope you had much fun watching it as much as I had doing it. And I'll see you next time or next video, or as we say in Portuguese, até a próxima.